Today, let's talk about hell. Well, we covered heaven, didn't we? So now let's do hell. It's only fair. First of all, hell is not really a thing in most of the Old Testament. The Old Testament speaks usually instead of a place called Sheol. This is the place where the dead go. All the dead. It's a shadowy, gloomy underworld, and everyone ends up there regardless of their moral conduct during life. It's a kind of half-life, a shadowy existence. It's not particularly pleasant by the sound of it, but it's not a place of punishment either. It's a continuation of life in a diminished kind of state. At best, it could be described as a place of rest. Insofar as the fate of the wicked is addressed elsewhere in the Old Testament, any punishment they may suffer is thought of in terms of earthly consequences. Sometimes the wicked are just destroyed. The idea of some kind of everlasting punishment begins to develop during the Intertestamental period, after the return from exile in Babylon in around 538 BCE, and before the New Testament era. I've made other videos about how the concepts of Satan, demons, and the cosmic warfare between good and evil, how these principles developed during this period. It's not at all surprising, then, that the concept of hell begins to develop in this period too. There are various books outside the Old Testament canon that talk about this stuff, like the Book of Enoch, for example. But within the Old Testament, the best example is the Book of Daniel, which is among the latest of the texts in the Old Testament. Most scholars tend to think so anyway, probably dating from the 2nd century BCE. There we find mention of resurrection of the body and a clear distinction between the fate of the righteous and the wicked. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And, as in the case of Satan and demons and cosmic warfare, we can see here the influence of Zoroastrianism and Hellenistic thought. Interestingly, although it's usually argued that the concept of God is much nicer in the New Testament than the Old Testament, he's described as Father, as loving, and all that, the concept of hell is actually much, much nastier. Now we find the concept of hell, usually called Gehenna, as a place of eternal torment with lakes of fire, gnashing of teeth, all that stuff. The stuff that the medieval church and contemporary evangelical Christianity seems to revel in so much. Funny how we seem to have given so much more thought to hell than to heaven. I think I know why, though. I think the Christian concept of heaven is so vague and unappealing that it was never going to win people over. The carrot just isn't sweet enough. So we need the stick instead. If we can't lure them to heaven with promises, we'll drive them there with threats of hellfire. That's much more effective. So, naturally, the concept of hell gets fleshed out a lot more than the concept of heaven. I'm not particularly attracted to heaven if they don't serve supreme pizzas with anchovies, but I sure as hell, pun intended, don't want to spend eternity in a lake of fire. Beside a lake of fire, heaven, as dull as it may sound, seems like the better option. So Gehenna becomes a place of eternal torment, with descriptions becoming more and more lurid, more and more detailed and graphic as the centuries roll by. Heaven remains as dull as ever. So when it comes to dealing with bad folk, the wicked, people like me who simply choose not to believe because the evidence is practically non-existent. When it comes to us evil folk, the God of the New Testament is much crueler than the God of the Old Testament. Now, can this be considered in any way just? In any way commensurate with the evil that has supposedly been committed? Basically, the whole sin thing originates with the fall in the Garden of Eden, with the disobedience of Adam and Eve, which doesn't really seem such a big deal, honestly. It's hard to imagine any kind of justice system that would argue for banishment, the placing of additional burdens on the culprits, such as pain in childbirth and sweating and toiling on the land, and ultimately death, let alone the punishment of the entire human race, all of Adam and Eve's descendants, just for this offence. But it's this original sin which apparently corrupts human nature so thoroughly, weakens human will, and gives us the propensity towards sin. Apparently Adam and Eve managed this sin on their own without any prior propensity for sin, which would seem much worse, surely. But we poor, weak human beings who've committed the crime of being born, and maybe on top of this now, not believing in this God and his Jesus, we are now subject to eternal torment. Sure, that all seems fair and just, right? Funny how we corrupt human beings actually regard torturing people for their crimes, for real crimes that is, let alone torturing them for all time. We regard that as something morally objectionable, to be avoided. We haven't always thought this way, that's true, and sometimes we or someone somewhere fall back into this barbaric behaviour, into this barbaric notion of punishment. But generally, most of us, in our best moments, do at least regard this practice as barbaric. We probably wouldn't think that even the worst criminal should be tossed into a fiery lake to be tormented forever. Well, maybe some of us actually would think that. Maybe some of the Christians among us, for example. After all, if it's good enough for God,